Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Lillian Omutoko, a member of Kenyatta National Hospital, University of Nairobi Ethics Committee and National Bioethics Committee. And this morning we will look at the ethical considerations in working with vulnerable populations. And vulnerable populations are also referred to as special groups, because of the different characteristics that certain populations will have at different times. So what would need to know, first of all, is how vulnerable populations are described. And the most important thing about vulnerable populations is that they are those people who may not be in a position to make informed decisions. And National Institutes of Health defines these populations as individuals whose willingness to volunteer may be unduly influenced by their expectations of benefits when they participate, or a retaliatory response from their refusal to participate. So you find that such populations may be influenced not by an interest in participating, but because of what they think they are going to gain when they participate, or the fear that they would be having if they don't participate, depending on who is asking them to participate in a particular study. There are predetermined vulnerable populations, and when we talk about these groups, we talk about women, we talk about children, we talk about prisoners, those who are mentally retarded, those who are in institutions, and so on. But amongst these predetermined groups, there are also different vulnerabilities. There are layers of vulnerabilities. Because, for example, we are saying that women are a vulnerable population. But amongst women, if they are the participants, you would find pregnant women. So that means that is a second layer of vulnerability. Amongst the same group of women, they could be economically disadvantaged. That brings in a third layer. The same woman could be having a low level of education. And so that you find that one single person or a particular group will be having different types of vulnerabilities. And the way that we address these vulnerabilities as researchers should be determined by the kind of vulnerabilities that are existing, without taking vulnerability as being common to each and every one. Therefore, requiring that the consideration is determined. So that requires researchers, therefore, to consider all potentially relevant factors, just like I have said, to determine the vulnerability of a particular individual, because this person will again be influenced by the expectations that they have, or the expected retaliation, or the effect that could be on them, that is by the fact that whoever it is who is administering that particular study. So it is necessary to think about the intrinsic and the extrinsic factors. As we engage in research, as we plan for research, we need to think about the very individuals as far as it is possible. For example, this particular project that has been undertaken had, I am sure, it had people of different gender, people with different income, people with different educational levels, people with different health status, people with different kind of housing. As much as we are talking about the informal settlement, within the informal settlement, there are also variations in the types of housing. Then there are extrinsic factors that we also need to consider in terms of what are the requirements of this particular study vis-a-vis or against their intrinsic factors. Is this population going to be able to participate in this study? Are they going to be able to give us the information that we require? The other thing that needs to be determined is where the study will take place or where the data is going to be collected. Who is it who is conducting the research? Because who conducts the research determines to a great extent how much information can be gathered. If it is within the informal settlement, of course, there's always the suspicion that people have. And so selection of the people to conduct the data is quite important so that these people do not feel that they are at risk. So researchers are encouraged to determine vulnerability and not use the predetermined categorization that there is as far as participation is concerned. The little that I know about action against hunger, the concern, I think, was nutrition in informal settlements. I stand to be corrected. And so some of the questions that I just thought about, or I thought that were addressed, were what is the magnitude of the problem? And are there other problems in that particular community? Another question that must have been considered is what is the priority concern in this particular community? Because sometimes as researchers, when we go out there, we may not know what the issues are, and it is our honors then to find out what the actual concerns of that particular community is so that they are addressed. But while looking at nutrition, I see there were add-ons in terms of food security and livelihoods, water sanitation, and hygiene factors. So having focused on all these issues then, perhaps it is possible that the needs of that particular community were addressed, but I'm sure there were other needs. Now, to guide us in making ethical decisions without exploiting the particular populations, we would be guided by the principles of ethics, one being respect. That as we engage with these people, so as we engage with the particular community, we need to respect them and ensure that we cater for privacy and confidentiality. So respecting individuals in research then requires that they make decisions that are not influenced in any way. The other principle is beneficence, whereby we need to ensure that the research that we carry out does not harm the participants in any way. We are talking about an African setup here, and decision makers are men. So that would have to be taken into consideration, that as the women are participating, the intricate details of the family setup are not interfered with. And so it would be good it is actually necessary to weigh to assess the benefits and the risks as the participants engage in this study. The other principle is justice, which has to do with protection from exploitation. There are quite a number of cases where you find studies being carried out, not for the benefit of the participants, but many times for the benefit of those who are carrying out the research. In medical research, a good example is the Tuskegee study, where Black African men were recruited to participate in a study. And there was so many, that study was not being carried out for their benefit, but more for finding out the effect of treatment of syphilis on the white race. So that then brings in the idea of identity and all that. So populations need to be protected from exploitation. That as they participate in research, they also benefit from the research that is being carried out to improve their lives, to give them information, give them knowledge, and so on. And the other thing when it comes to justice is that there needs to be fair access to participate. Many times we come across situations where potential participants who are not competent in English and Kiswahili, which are the formal languages in this country, are not recruited to participate. So that then means that there's an element of discrimination. So selection needs to be fair, because anyone who is likely to benefit from that particular study should be allowed to participate. So then it is upon us as researchers to recruit all those who might benefit, even if it is hard for them to recruit. It is our responsibility as researchers to come up with ways to manage the difficulties so that these people participate. Now, one of the things that needs to be done when preparing to conduct a study within a community or within a particular population is to build and train a research team. Now, the research team that is being built needs to be a research team that has people who have the expertise that is required in that particular study, so that they have the competence that is required to carry out that study successfully. Them having that expertise is not enough. They also need to be trained so that the research team can be able to carry out that study in a competent manner, taking care of all the intricate issues that arise from conducting research. Now, we normally require that project team members do training in bioethics, because it is through this training that they will be able to know what ethical considerations they are going to make, because ethical considerations are not cast on stone. And you come across situations that you never even thought about, and so you find yourself in an ethical dilemma. So how are you going to handle an ethical dilemma? So as I'm talking about training, I'm not talking about training that is very formal, that requires you to be in class and all that. There are quite a number of online courses that are free that members of the research team can do, so that they are well aware of what is expected of them as far as handling special populations is concerned, and even when you're dealing with other kinds of populations. Now, training of the research team then helps in creating a rapport, within the team members, so that they're able to work together, and also increases understanding of the research, so that while they're out in the field, then they will be comfortable in discussing sensitive topics, and they'll also be comfortable in handling the issues that arise. So we move on and look at the considerations in designing a study for vulnerable populations. Something that is key is how to approach the communities. First and foremost, any study that is to be carried out in any community or wherever it is that it is being carried out, there is need to seek ethical approval. Internationally, they are called institutional review boards. In Kenya, we call them institutional ethical review committees or ethics review committees. Now, it is necessary to seek approval from the IRBs, and it is at that point that one will get approval to carry out the study or not. But usually, we do not reject applications for approval, but we advise as to what needs to be done by the research team or by the principal investigator, so that all ethical issues are addressed. But we do not only look at the ethical issues, we also look at the science, because bad science would lead to bad ethics. So that is the first thing that needs to be done to seek approval. The other thing is community entry. When I think about the informal settlements, how does one get to start doing anything in an informal settlement? How do you get in there? How do you get the people that you require to participate in the study? Now, one way of getting into the community is through gatekeepers. And the gatekeepers would be the people that we call opinion leaders. So you would have perhaps the administrators, the chiefs. If you're targeting institutions, then you'd have the heads of those institutions. But before you get to the gatekeepers, it would be good to establish a contact person, because it is this contact person that will now lead you to the opinion leaders within that particular community. But when it comes to when that is done, then the gatekeepers will be used as a point of entry, but they cannot be used for obtaining consent, because group consent is not ethical. There's no way I would say yes for each and every one of you. So it is necessary to work then with the gatekeepers to now get to the particular people of interest. And during the recruitment point, then you'd need to obtain individual consent. Now, the gatekeepers on their own would not manage to assist during the conducting of a particular study. So the research team or the principal investigator needs to take it upon himself to come up with a community advisory board. But before coming up with a specific advisory board for this particular study, one can make use of the existing community advisory boards. Because when it comes to opinion leaders, the same opinion leaders will sit in the various community advisory boards, and you can be able to get advice as to who is best to sit in your particular advisory board. Now, the other ways of creating rapport and building acceptance in the community is getting in touch with the community-based organizations and even faith-based organizations, so that you have a team of people that you can work with, and this then makes it possible for you to do what you want to do comfortably without resistance. Now, while still approaching communities, I think it is necessary to do some kind of needs assessment to find out the community needs, so that by the end of the day, the community needs are addressed and even met. And to do this, perhaps to start it off, information from leaders or even a reconnaissance survey would inform that particular study, so that one does not just come up with a preconceived idea. Because like being in Kenya, it's Africa, we have our neighbors. There's no way I'll just get to Uganda. Yes, we have the same kind of problems, but I cannot just go to Uganda and carry out a study on the presumption of my experiences in Kenya. I would have to go there and find out what are the issues that they actually have, so that the research that I carry out seeks to address their particular needs. Now, while approaching communities, there's the issue of the consent form, and I've already said that you cannot take group consent, but you need to obtain individual consent. But the question that arises is how to approach the participants to obtain consent. You've got to think about when to obtain this consent. Just to give an example, if you are doing a study on, this particular project that is being run, Action Against Hunger, and you are approaching people perhaps at lunchtime and their problem is hunger, surely these people are not going to listen to you. They would even be offended that you're asking them about, perhaps nutrition and all that kind of thing. So timing becomes very important, actually a special consideration while obtaining consent. Now, the consent form needs to be written in a language that is simple and straightforward, comprehensible language. In the international setup, we talk about the consent form being at 6th grade level, and we could get the equivalent of that and perhaps talk about basic education at the lower primary level. So it should be very clear so that the participants can understand the consent form and make decisions based on that consent form. But because we have different kinds of people participating, of course you'll expect situations whereby the potential participants may not understand what is in the consent form. So it will be upon the person who was obtaining consent to modify the consent form. But the modification will not be in the consent form itself, but modification in the way that you administer it, modification in the way that you explain the consent form, so that you could be sitting with a participant, you could be asking them questions, and even asking them to seek clarification, so that at the end of the day, they have understood what the study is about. Because we know that sometimes participants will participate not because of what they are bringing in, but because of the potential benefits. But you do not want people to participate because of what they are going to benefit from participating in the study. The other thing is the location for data collection. Where will this data be collected? Is it a place that gives privacy and protects confidentiality? If you're going to carry out an interview, then you have to make sure that that data will be collected in a room that is private, that allows you to carry out the interview successfully. So the location is very important. And again, it may be tricky if you think about collecting data in a totally different setup from where the people are staying, because there will be issues of transport which will then bring in the necessity for compensation and so on, and that will increase costs. So it's good to think about the location for data collection. In addition to that, there is authority that needs to be sought from the relevant institutions. If there are children who are participating, then the head of the institution needs to give authority for you to carry on. But even when this authority is given by the head of the institution, the children will still have to assent. But they cannot give assent or what is required is that you seek parental consent if there are children the children are below 16. There are variations as to who is a child and who is an adult. Again, we come back to vulnerabilities. If you have a child, a girl who is 16 years old, and that girl has a child, then that girl ceases to be a child but is an emancipated minor. So that kind of a person then will give consent. You do not need to obtain assent and then seek parental consent. So when it comes to that last bullet, then you've got to look at the characteristics of that particular participant. The authority that is given by the head of the institution is not a green light to carry on with collection of data, because obtaining of consent is important. The other ethical considerations that are made have to do with voluntary participation, and that is addressed in the consenting process. Then the other thing is assessment of the benefits and risks, which have to be explained to the participants so that they know that then when they participate in this study, this is what is expected of them. So just to add on to that, the study procedure needs to be explained so that they know what part they are going to play in that particular research. Then they would also need to know what are the benefits and what are the risks. And that needs to be explained quite clearly so that anyone who's participating knows what risks there are. Now, in social research, the risks are quite often minimal because the studies are not invasive, and therefore there will be minimum risk. But the minimal risks that are there are risks that would still affect the participants. And so the kind of risks that we talk about in social research are to do with emotional imbalance, psychological distress, discomfort, and all that. So that needs to be addressed so that if a participant feels uncomfortable, then they should be allowed to withdraw. And that clause needs to be included in the consent form so that participants are well aware that anytime that they feel uncomfortable, they can skip that particular question or altogether withdraw, so that their participation ultimately is voluntary participation. Another thing that is quite debatable is compensation. Many times, researchers are not quite sure as to how to compensate. How much is compensation? Are you compensating for the time perhaps that the person has spent, or are you paying them? So there's usually a thin line between compensation and incentives. But the question is, are we supposed to give incentives to participants? Because again, when you give participants, then some people will participate not because of what they're likely to benefit or what information they would give or all that, but rather the benefits that they are going to get. And this is very tricky, especially when you're dealing with special groups. Because if you're carrying out a study in an informal settlement, quite often there are people who are economically disadvantaged. And if you're going to pay them some money, then they'll participate because of that money and perhaps not even give you the information that you require. So that then brings in the question of inclusion and exclusion, so that you need to define who should participate in the study and who shouldn't participate in the study. So the characteristics need to be defined quite well so that the recruitment is recruitment that will be beneficial to the study. Now, what we normally do is that when it comes to compensation, then we advise that compensation should be tied to something, so that it is not too much or too little. Because if you're going to compensate an individual for the time that they've spent in your study, it would be pegged on the qualification of that person. So if perhaps you're having a consultant who is participating in your study, and you have young mother in the informal settlements, then there will be a variation there. There will be inequity, that the consultant will be paid much higher and this young mother will be paid much less. So we recommend that compensation perhaps is pegged on traveling costs, for example, so that it is something that is humble, that does not create inequity, again, within the research study. And when it comes to incentives, again, they need to be incentives that are humble. Sometimes people talk about maybe juice or soda, biscuits, and that kind of thing, just to appreciate people. So that is something debatable, and researchers usually come up with ways of dealing with it, so long as it is not too high or exploitative. Other issues have to do with retention. Once you recruit participants, how do you ensure that they remain in the study? And the other thing is in handling anticipated events. I don't know what your experiences have been out there in the field. I don't know whether you have had an anticipated events and I don't know how you handled them. But in that kind of setup, you would find that security sometimes security is not very good, and maybe the research team members may be threatened, or there's crime and all that. There are the questions of safety. And that could be an anticipated event that was not handled at the beginning or during training. So perhaps that would require that the team is trained on how they're going to handle their anticipated events. So the Ethics Review Committee requires that when that kind of thing happens, then the committee needs to be informed as to the modification, because definitely that will be a modification to the protocol, and that needs to be reported as an anticipated event. Now, in medical ethics, we talk about it in terms of adverse events, but in social science research, it will just be an anticipated event. So it will just be a matter of information. We've already talked about withdrawal. Something that is a major concern currently in bioethics is the post-research obligations. That yes, you're carrying out a study in a particular community, but what is it that this particular community has benefited from that study? Yes, the study has been addressing malnutrition, but what is it that you're going to leave, so to speak, for this particular community so that they do not remain the same way that they were before you came to the ground? Quite often the concern of funders is the availability of funds for addressing post-research obligations. But the benefits can be created in such a way that it doesn't quite require a lot of funding. And one of the ways that most funders appreciate is capacity building. That you can give this population, you can train social workers, for example, who will then train the people within that community so that they can be able to handle nutritional issues, to improve the livelihoods of those people. You can come up or teach them and perhaps provide a project that is not heavily capital-based. Like in the informal settlements, you could have introduced an income-generating activity like making soap, which then will give these particular families or the women an income which enables them then to provide for the nutritional needs of their families. So those are some of the things that could be done without spending too much, but contributing to that particular community. Very important is dissemination of results. Because yes, data has been collected. There is an outcome. This community that participated needs to know what is it that was found out and how can they best use this information, or they need to be advised as to what is it that they need to do as far as the results are concerned. And then perhaps there could be interventions, if it is possible, or even a follow-up strategy that even after termination of the project, there's still a link between that particular community and the research group, so that what is being done is not a one-time affair, but something that to some extent can continue to benefit that particular community. Now, I don't know what retention strategies you used, but some of the retention strategies that can be used is perhaps before, at the beginning of every session, you could start off the session with a snack and an informal catch-up amongst the people, because then the people would appreciate that. And you could also have maybe a place where the participants can stop by and drink water, wash their hands, or even use a restroom, because those are some of the needs in the informal settlements. And then there's the question of the tracking systems. What kind of tracking systems do you have to ensure that you have your participants participating and you can be able to get in touch with them when you get difficulties? So there's need to come up with a tracking system. Now, what are the strategies that can be used to overcome challenges? In the process of conducting research, it doesn't quite turn out as planned. And sometimes there are resistances. And one way of handling this is raising awareness amongst the community members, amongst the community leaders, amongst the government, the representatives of the government and all that. Because when awareness is raised and people are sensitized, then whenever there is an issue, you know where to go to. For example, if there's an insecurity issue, you know whom to contact amongst the government representatives. Then the other thing that can help overcome challenges is assembling a community advisory board. And the membership of a community advisory board is very important, so that those who would sit in that board should be people who have an influence in the community. For example, you would have a policeman sitting in that board, you would have a church elder sitting in that board, you would have a teacher sitting in that board, you would have somebody from the health sector sitting in that board, so that there are people who can reach out and people who have information that would benefit the research, while at the same time, they can be able to give you feedback as to what the feelings of that particular community is, so that amendments are made without disrupting the research that is going on. Then the other thing is communication of results and ensuring that benefits accrue to participants, so that the participants don't feel like they are being exploited. There are studies that are carried out in phases. So if a study is being carried out in phases, it would be kind to communicate what is going on as the study progresses. There are people who think that it is not good to include vulnerable populations in research, but I think it's quite important, because research gives voice to the voiceless. When we think about HIV/AIDS at the very beginning, and stigma and treatment, those who were affected at the very beginning protested and were asking to be given the medicines that were on trial. As much as the clinical trials were not complete, they demanded that they are given those medicines, despite the fact that the risks had not been found out. So you see, through their protests, then they were able to give, they were able to bring out their feelings and express their needs, and then their needs were addressed. When we come to the informal settlements, in the kind of societies that we live in, sometimes we do not understand what is going on there. Sometimes they can be viewed as them. There's that bit of them and us, or them and them. So research is able to give a voice to the voiceless, and in that way then their needs can be addressed in a way that is manageable. Now, another thing that is important is having an exit strategy. That as much as our study will have come to an end, there should be arrangements that are made for continuity and for sustainability. And this would be done by developing a structure that can take over the activities that are initiated. If capacity building is one of them, there should be a plan as to how that can be continued thereafter, without the funder having to continue funding that particular project, so that the community is able to manage the circumstances, and so that the outcome of those particular results will benefit that community at the present time and in future. So the termination of a project should not mean that that is the end of the life of that project.